Welcome to Verastahl, a YouTube channel devoted to my horror stories. I'm Brandon Faircloth, and if you enjoy the story you're about to hear, please like, share, and subscribe. If you check the links down in the description, you can find all of my books on Amazon, including my newest book, The Joker's Wild, as well as the books that this story that I'm reading today actually comes from. Those books are called The Outsiders, and so far there are 2 books in that series with more to come. Today's story is called I Think My Grandfather Might Be a Serial Killer, Part 5. Sound travels farther in cold weather. It's called refraction. Essentially, the sound waves that are in the higher, warmer air that is farther from cold ground move faster through the more excited air molecules and get pushed back downward. So sound gets amplified closer to the ground. I knew that at the time, though I didn't learn the science behind it until later. That night I was just wondering how far away the screams of the little boy were coming from. It had been 5 weeks since I'd returned from Olathe, and in that time I'd found out little new beyond some information about the last girl who had been killed. A pretty blonde girl in her sophomore year of college. She had 2 parents and a brother that the newspapers bled for grief and drama for a couple of weeks before moving on to the next tragedy. But it wasn't over for them. It would never be over for any of us. It would have been an easy thing to add their imagined pain to my own and use it as all the justification I needed to end this now, to end him now. But for all my circumstantial evidence, I had nothing definitive. Even the DNA from your grandmother's nails, while compelling, didn't eliminate any other explanation, and given what I intended on doing to him, I needed to be sure. I'd stayed busy in the intervening weeks, both in surveilling Salk and my work, as well as more fully preparing for when I finally took him, if it came to that. I purchased, again slowly and with great discretion, a variety of medical supplies and tools. I found an old moving truck from a defunct company that I got cheap with cash. The container body of that truck is where I set up Salk's room. I bolted a table to the floor and attached straps and chains to it. I attached lights to the interior corners of the container and added a row of shelves and a chair to one side. I even welded an IV stand to the wall so I could keep him fed with whatever cocktail of saline and drugs I needed to keep him alive. I planned on torturing him for a long time, and I didn't want him dying from shock or infection. I told myself I was going to do all these things to get information, to get answers to the hows and whys of what all he had done. But that was only partially true. In my heart of hearts, I knew I was going to do it whether he gave me the answers or not. I hated that part of myself, but if I was going to control it, I had to accept it. So I prepared the room Salk would slowly die in, while salving my conscience with the knowledge that I was being thorough and fair before I took him. Of course, that's not how things played out. One night, the night of the screams and so much more, I was watching Salk's house with the dull-eyed enthusiasm of a sentry who always guards the same post. I had been there for close to 8 hours and was close to packing up to get some rest when Salk suddenly came out of his house and got in his car. This was strange for him. It was nearly 8 in the evening and he never left the house after 6 except for the time I'd been in the closet. The night the girl was taken. Feeling my pulse pounding in my head, I waited until I was sure he was almost out of sight, and then I pulled out and began to follow him. We drove for well over an hour, and despite the darkness of the hour and the other cars on the road, I couldn't help but feel conspicuous. I hung back as much as I dared, but I couldn't risk losing him again. After going through town and traveling up the interstate over 80 miles, he got off at an exit full of rundown shopping centers and closed restaurants. At first I thought he had a particular place he was headed, but he just turned into the first large parking lot and began cruising through at a low speed, even circling around to the back side of what looked to be a defunct electronics store and a couple of clothing outlets. After he had made a complete circuit, he moved on to the next one, and then the next. Once I understood what he was doing, it made it easier for me to hang back and observe. I would stay up near the street and park, waiting for him to finish looking for whatever or whoever he was looking for before easing back behind him and into the next lot. It was nearly 10 now, and many of the places were closed, but there were enough cars still around that I should have been hard to notice at such a distance. That distance was a mistake. We were in the fourth parking lot, and as I waited for him to come back around from driving the backside of the grocery store and the smaller stores that made up this latest decaying shopping center, I realized it was taking too long. I put the car back in drive and eased around to the back, mimicking the direction he had gone. As I turned the corner, in the distance I saw him shoving a boy of around 10 into the car. I began to speed up, but he was fast and far away. By the time I reached where the boy had been taken, Salt was already pulling out onto some back road that led away from the lot. I followed, abandoning any pretense of stealth now. I worried that me chasing him could cause him to hurt the boy sooner rather than later, but I had to take the chance. If Salt got away, the boy was going to die. The road we were taking was small and winding, leading through a neighborhood and then further away from buildings and lights. My little spy car, while reliable, was not equipped with the best headlights or any great speed, and it took all of my concentration to keep on the road while not losing ground as I pursued them. We were 10 miles out of town now, fields of lightly frosted farmland reflecting the ghost glow of winter moonlight as we threaded our way through the darkness. We passed a home that was brightly lit with twinkling colored lights and molded plastic reindeer, and it occurred to me that Christmas had been the week before and I hadn't noticed. Farmland began to give way to woods, and I noticed with rising panic that I was running low on gas. Enough to get back to town, to get the boy help, but just barely. This needed to end now. I stomped the pedal as far down as it would go, and the car jumped forward with a protesting whine. I wasn't sure how long I could maintain this speed without wrecking or the engine blowing up, but I didn't need long. Gripping the wheel tightly, I readied myself as the nose of my car reached within a foot of Salk's back bumper. At the next curve, I moved into the left lane long enough to gain half a length more, then swung the front fender of my car into his back tire. The effect was immediate. He began to spin out, but then so did I. I tried to regain control of the car, but it was too late. I jumped the shallow ditch on the right side of the road, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, my car was somehow still running, its hood crumpled from going head-on into a medium-sized maple tree. Judging by the car clock, only a few minutes had passed, but that was more than enough time for Salt to get away. I tried to look out my window, but it was fogged up beyond any visibility, so I just opened the door and slowly got out. My head was swimmy, and I had a small gash where I'd hit my head on the steering wheel, but otherwise I seemed okay. Steadying myself against the car, I looked around and saw Salk's car wrecked in the far deeper left ditch 50 feet down the road. The front doors to the car were open, and there was no sign of anyone. I started making my way up the road to the car, and it didn't take long before I saw the drag marks leading away into the woods. I patted my pockets. I had my gun and a folding knife on me, and that would have to do. Following the path wasn't hard at first, with the moonlight throwing the thick ravines of ice, snow, and dirt into sharp relief. As I got deeper into the trees, however, the shadows and undergrowth began to slow my progress. That's when the boy began screaming. I picked up my pace again, moving at a loping, unsteady run as I tried to gauge direction through a combination of sight and sound. The boy's cries were becoming louder, but they were also becoming more shrill and frantic as they moved from fear into terror. I pushed through a last thick stand of pines, and then I saw why the boy was screaming so. This is where I have to ask for your patience more than anything that's come before. I understand I'm giving you a great deal of detail to explain everything fully, but despite the strangeness of much of it, I don't know that anything so far has fallen entirely outside of what you understand as possible. This next part, I will do my best to describe it, but you need to understand, I will fail to really do it justice, and it will sound unbelievable. Just try to bear with me as best you can. I pushed through those trees and stumbled into a small clearing, the cold white moonlight shining down like a spotlight over the scene. The boy, he looked closer to 8 now that I was closer, was down on its back trying to scrabble away from the thing towering over him. Salt was nowhere to be seen. As for the thing itself, it stood on 2 legs and was half again as big as a man. From behind, I could see its legs were digitigrade, like the legs of a dog or cat, though they reminded me more of a rat's legs. It had no tail, I could see, but just relatively small hips that swiftly expanded into a large muscular torso. The back of that torso was largely covered with matted gray hair, though it became patchy and seemed to transition into some kind of black chitin as it moved toward the head. I took all of this in quickly and while still moving forward slowly, but then it turned to face me. Its head was a strange mix of reptile and insect, reminding me of a cross between a large beetle and a snake. A large black shell hooded a long face set with burning yellow eyes and a mouth that was full of long, curved teeth. The strangest thing about it was its arms. They were different from each other. One was heavy and thick, made out of that same black material and shaped into some kind of savage club that tapered to a spiky lump at the end. The other was a slender, furry hand with fingers that were long and almost graceful looking, each tip punctuated by a hooked claw. As it regarded me, I involuntarily took a step back. My mind was having trouble reconciling what it was seeing. How was I supposed to deal with something like this? Still, I had to try. I fumbled and pulled the gun from my coat pocket, leveled it at the creature, and fired. I saw the round strike just before hearing the wet thudding sound it made. The creature seemed unfazed. I fired again and again. I emptied 13 rounds into that thing, and it didn't stagger, didn't bleed. It just took it without complaint. Then I realized it was making a sound after all. It was low at first, and I couldn't identify it. When I did, I felt my bowels loosen. It was laughing. The sound was terrible, like wet meat and rocks being tumbled in an old dryer, but I could tell that's what it was. Whatever this thing was, it was laughing at me. Looking back to the child who had been transfixed by all this, I yelled for him to run. I still don't know if that's what killed him, and I tried to tell myself he was going to die regardless, but as I yelled, the creature turned back to him and brought its massive club arm down on his stomach. The boy, well, he burst open. The arm was brought down a second and a third time, but he was well dead before then, the force from the blows shattering his bones and sending jets of blood and ruined flesh shooting off in streams from the point of impact. The thing turned back to me, still laughing its awful laugh, and I swear I could see in that mouth of knives, it's smiling at me. So I ran. My mind was half gone at this point, and I can't say I was even heading back toward the road. Over the sound of blood in my ears, I could hear the terrible thudding crash of the monster pursuing me. I I tried to go faster, but my vision was beginning to swim and I found myself struggling to keep my feet. I felt more than heard its hot, ragged breath on my back, and I was turning to try to fight it off, but suddenly I was flying through the air. Pain flared through my neck and shoulders as I struck something hard, and then I was out again. When I came to, I was in a room of some kind. It looked like a basement with cinder block walls and the musty air of disuse. The room was fairly large, stretching out into a darkness that was not illuminated by the single pool of light the overhead bulb afforded. I was tied in a chair, ropes at my wrists and ankles, bungee cord around my chest. I tried to rock the chair, but either it was very heavy or secured somehow because it didn't budge. Next, I tried to listen for any sign of noise, any clue as to where I was or who might be around. Nothing. Finally, I went back to studying my surroundings, peering into the dark for any further information I could find. That's when I saw his eyes. Salk's eyes were reflecting the light from the overhead bulb, and as I stared into the blackness, I could slowly make out his still form. He said nothing, but after another few seconds of studying me, he stepped forward into the light, his eyes still fixed upon me. He was smiling again, and this time it looked very genuine. Part 6. The reason you're alive, in case you were wondering, is I need to know what you know and who you've told. Salk's voice had lost any of the forced jocularity that I was used to hearing the times that we had intersected at the hospital. He stood in front of me, hands on his waist and the unpleasant smile still on his lips, as though he was getting ready to punish an unruly child and savored the idea. I understand you can lie, and I understand that torture is not foolproof. But I have to try, don't I? I looked up at him, fear and rage warring in my heart. I know you're a murderer. I know you killed Rebecca. Salk gave a faint wince as I said her name. Yeah, that was not my best choice. I knew that taking someone from where I worked was risky, but I needed someone, and she was just there, like a gift. It was easy at the time, but hindsight is a bitch. If I had known you were going to be a super sleuth, I would have tried to hold off. He smiled again, and I was reminded of Alicia comparing him to a shark. It was out. But let's move past that. What do you really know? I felt my jaw clenching as anger won out. Fuck you. I've told you the only thing that's important. The expression fell off Salk's face like rotten meat off a bone. Dead-eyed and silent, he bent down and began pulling off my right shoe. I tried to struggle briefly, but I didn't budge. And I needed to save my energy for when I could make it count. My left wrist seemed to be slightly looser, so Salk reached back into the pool of darkness surrounding us, and I heard the sound of metal being dragged across concrete a moment before the hammer came into view. He brought the hammer up to my face for a moment, but he didn't ask another question. Instead, he brought the head of the hammer down on my right pinky toe with enough force to burst the flesh and pulverize the bone. I know I screamed, but I don't remember it. I was too concerned with a bomb going off in my head as the pain reached my brain. I felt myself slip towards blackness and then back out again. My head was spinning as I gasped for breath, and I realized I was flailing involuntarily, as if my body had decided it was time to escape regardless of any plan I might have. With great effort, I slowed my breathing and movement. It was hard to think about anything but the pain, but I had to try and hold on. I couldn't see my foot, but I could tell from the force and the spray of blood that had shot across the floor into the dark that the toe was crushed, if not torn off completely. That meant I would be slower if I had to run, but it might possibly make my foot easier to slip free if I didn't black out. Of course, that was always assuming he ever left me alone long enough for me to try before he had broken me too badly for it to matter. Salt was snapping his fingers in front of my face, his expression still blank, but his voice cold and angry. Pay attention. This is your next chance. What else do you know? I knew I needed to cooperate, at least partially, to minimize any damage and slow things down. Through clenched teeth, I muttered, I know you give things to that monster to kill, or you are the monster. I don't see how you could be, but who knows? That's what else I know. He nodded. So you don't know much, it sounds like. If you're telling the truth, which you probably aren't. But still, a good start. He suddenly slammed the hammer down again on my foot a bit further in. My world exploded into red and black, and this time I heard myself screaming for a moment before I blacked out. When I came to, Salk was just standing there, arms by his side, bloody hammer in his left hand. His eyes rolled toward me as I opened my eyes, but he didn't move yet. Just stood there, statue still, watching me for a while as I tried to get my thoughts together. When he spoke, his voice was still flat, but sounded lighter, as though he was happier than he had been. Glad to see you're back. You're down 3 toes now, I'm afraid. In my expert opinion, they're beyond saving. His gaze flicked down to my feet for a moment. 2 of them are pretty much not there anymore, if I'm honest. But hopefully this is making my point. This is how much I hurt you when you cooperate. Imagine how much worse it'll be if you don't. I know how to break nearly every bone in your body without you dying from it quickly. And while I'm ill-equipped to keep you alive long-term here, I can certainly break you enough that the rot and infection that slowly kills you down in this hole will make this. He waved the hammer toward my feet like the scepter of a bored king. Seem like a pleasure. I was barely listening to what he was saying. I was too focused on trying to not look at his bloody finger. I had been watching him closely since I first woke here, and I hadn't seen any signs of him being faster or stronger than I would expect. If he typically hid some preternatural strength or agility, it seemed unlikely he would hide it now, particularly when he was trying so hard to frighten me. But it wasn't much hope by itself. Even normal Marcus Salk was perfectly capable of torturing and killing me as he was, to say nothing of that monster I'd seen, whether it was tied to Salk or somehow sprang from the man itself. But then, when I woke up, as he gave his best intimidating monologue and waved his hammer around, I saw it. His right index finger was bleeding. That was the hand he was using to hold my foot when he hit it. And that told me 2 things. First, he wasn't especially coordinated. Second, he could still be hurt. Ready to answer my next question? His voice remained lifeless, but it still had that lighter, almost merry edge to it. He was enjoying himself. I nodded, making a point of moving slower and more warily than I actually felt. Yes, Water, please." I rasped my voice as much as I could, which wasn't hard in my current condition. It was hard to see what Salt was thinking, his face an emotionless mask as he seemed to consider my request. I felt my heart sinking as several seconds seemed to pass, but then his eyes shifted up in what might have been a look of exasperation. "Fine. Be right back. Don't go anywhere." He turned and moved into the dark. A door opened and a light came on in the adjoining room. I could see much more of the basement now, including stairs at the far end that he had not taken. That meant there was water down here, and he would be back sooner. I frantically began tugging at my left arm, ignoring the pain and protest of my wrist as I yanked and twisted with all my strength. I had been right. The rope on my left wrist had some play in it, but I wasn't sure it was enough. I started sawing the rope back and forth across my wrist quickly instead, and within a few seconds I saw blood beginning to well around the rope. At the same time, I was aware of the light turning back off in the adjacent room as Salt returned. After a frantic motion to smear the blood more thoroughly on the rope, I gave a last pull to free my wrist. I felt something pop in it, but the blood had provided enough lubrication that it slipped free just as Salt stepped back into the light. Good. Just in time. "Seriously?" His voice was still too strangely flat to convey sarcasm well, but he punctuated it by throwing the glass of water he had brought in my face. He sat the glass itself down on the floor and then bent forward, gripping my left arm roughly with his left hand as he began undoing the rope around the chair arm with his right. This was what I was waiting for. I knew he favored his left hand, and that he would favor it more with his right when injured. He could have come at me from the side and been totally safe. But he was arrogant, and he thought I was secure, harmless. And the stupid bastard had tied my chest with a bungee cord. An adult male can bite down with over 200 pounds of pressure. Given the proper placement and force, it's more than enough to rip out the left internal and external carotid arteries in one bite. I had thought of the best angle if I got the chance, but I couldn't waste time trying to be perfect. In one movement, I leaned forward and down and then shot my face up into his neck, my mouth as wide as I could make it. Distracted by my arm and the rope, he couldn't react in time. I clamped down, grinding my teeth together as I felt skin, muscle, and then tendons give way. I shook my head as I pulled him towards me, and I felt the arteries begin to shred as new volumes of blood sprayed down my throat and out into the room around my lips. I still didn't let go, but I had realized that Salk had been squealing. Not really struggling or fighting back, just squealing like a dying animal. I didn't even hear it until it started to fade away. As his body went limp, the weight of it did most of the rest of the work for me. And with a wet snap, I was left with a mouthful of the man's throat as the rest of him crumpled to the floor. I spat it out and began working to get free. Even with my injured wrist, it didn't take long. I kept an eye on Salk the entire time. He had lost more blood than any person can lose and live, but I had seen too much already that night. When I was free, I took the hammer and beat his head until there was very little left. When there was no question about him coming back, I began to explore the basement. The room next door was actually a full living space, with a cot, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom. I found some bandages and antiseptic, and doing the best I could, I protected my foot for the short term. Salk had been telling the truth. The last 2 toes on my right foot were gone. After I was done with first aid, I began looking for any information that Salk could have left behind. Any clues about what was actually going on, what that creature was. but there was nothing that I could find. I felt my strength waning as the adrenaline started to wear off, so I got to work getting out of there. I quickly pilfered his pockets and found his keys as well as my own. Moving up the basement stairs, I found the door at the top was locked, but after a tense moment, I found the key on Salt's keyring. I tried to move quietly as I went upstairs, images of that terrible creature in the woods filling my head as I hobbled along. I was in a small ranch house, and when I opened the exterior door, I saw my battered little spy car outside. Apparently, Salk had been forced to take it when his was wrecked, and by some miracle, it had actually made it this far. I hoped it could make it a bit further. Standing in the doorway looking out, I saw I was out in the middle of nowhere. There was a dirt road leading away into the distance, but no sign of other lights from houses or cars. I could tell that the sky was starting to lighten as dawn approached, but that was of little comfort at the moment. Aside from the terrible pain, I also felt exposed in this strange place where anything could be lurking about. I quickly went back inside to spread around the contents of a gas can I'd found in the basement, making sure to saturate anywhere I'd traveled in Salk's body as I went. Going back outside, I tried my car, and it cranked up with a groaning whine. So far, so good. I'd actually forgotten to find something to light the gasoline in my idle state, but the cigarette lighter from the car and a scrounged up piece of paper from my floorboard did the trick, and in a few minutes I was driving away. Having no clue where I was, I saw the tracks on the dirt road seemed to show Salk had come from the right, so that's the direction I headed back in. Driving was awkward, as the car had no cruise control and I couldn't use my right foot to accelerate. Thankfully, it was an automatic, and while it wasn't comfortable, that inconvenience was the least of my worries. More troublesome was my consciousness, which was dipping in and out as I drove. Gritting my teeth, I bumped my right foot against the interior of the car lightly, the surge of pain making me groan but bring me back for the moment. I had a panicked thought and looked down at the gas gauge, remembering how low I'd been before the wreck. Apparently, Salk had to stop and get gas to get me all the way out here, because now there was over half a tank. I had the unironic thought that it was a lucky break, and then I started crying. Not just a little, but blinding, body-racking sobs to the point that I had to pull over. I sat there in my dingy little spy car for some time weeping. Part of it was the physical and emotional toll of the last few hours, but most of it was because it was over. Salt was finally dead. And that night, as I sat tied to his chair and said that killing him was the only thing that was important, I admit it. The monster, the mystery, none of that mattered. He had taken my life from me, my sweet, wonderful baby, and now I'd ended him. But while that was a relief in one way, it terrified me in another. For months I'd been preoccupied with stalking Salk, with preparing my revenge. Now that it was done, I found myself standing at the edge of my black despair, the ground weakening under my feet as the new reality set in. I had nothing left to do, nothing left to live for. Salk had taken my gun and knife, but there was still a box cutter in the glove compartment. I took it out and held it for a while, testing its feel in my palm and the accompanying idea in my mind. It was very tempting. But I kept thinking of what Rebecca would want me to do, and of that terrified little boy in the moments before he died. I wasn't done. I couldn't even say whether or not killing Salk had killed the monster or if it was still out there, and I hadn't come this far to quit on any of it, myself included. I cranked back up and drove on, hitting pavement and then a small town with a hospital nearly 3 hours from home. When hold up. I said, cutting my grandfather off mid-sentence. Just stop. He frowned and nodded. We had been sitting here for over 2 hours, and as the old man talked, I'd felt my anxiety grow into a kind of strange, angry fear. I stood up and began pacing to try to rid myself of some of the nervous injury I had been accumulating. So, to summarize, you killed this guy Salk, who killed your wife, and he either was this terrible beetle rat monster thing, or he was working with him? Is that the fucking short version? I realized I was yelling, but I didn't care. My grandfather opened his mouth to respond, but I talked over him. Okay, aside from the fact of how batshit crazy that is, let's just go with it for now. Let's even say that you did kill this Salt guy, who clearly couldn't be a monster because they don't fucking exist, but that you were justified because he really did kill Grandma. I paused to take a breath, and seeing the abject sadness on his face, I forced a calmer tone. How does any of that explain what I saw last night? What did you do to that woman? I was getting to that. There's a lot you still don't understand. I shook my head. No. What you're saying doesn't make any sense. I get that you've been through a lot. I do. And maybe you can't see how crazy some of this stuff is. But if you really believe all this stuff, you need help. I can't know what kind of help you need until I know what you've done. I tried to prepare myself for the question I'd been dreading asking all morning. Grandpa, did you kill that woman? He met my gaze solemnly, looking older in that moment than I'd ever seen him. I did. But again, there's more to it. I raised my hand. Sure. Aside from Salk and that woman, have you killed other people? He nodded, not even trying to explain further at this point. How many? His eyes didn't leave mine. That woman makes 87. I felt my knees going as I stumbled back against the kitchen counter. What? How? Fucking why? He looked dejected. I've been trying to tell you why. It's not an easy or quick thing to explain. I dug into my pocket as he was talking. Yeah, I guess not. Pulling out my phone, I tapped out 911 and hit call. After a moment of silence, I heard it ring, and then a woman's voice was on the line. 911? What's your emergency? My throat was suddenly dry as a bone. My grandfather sat silently staring at me from the table without protest, just watching. I finally managed to croak out, I think there's been a murder here. I think my grandfather killed someone. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. And also click the notification bell, as it does seem to help people get notified when new parts of this story as well as others come up. You can also visit Verastahl.com for more information about my books, news, and updates. Until next time.